On the evening of October 31st, 1955, a Thursday, a short typed statement was carried from Clarence House to the BBC. The broadcaster interrupted its regular programming to read it. Across Britain, in sitting rooms and kitchens and pubs where the wireless was on, people stopped what they were doing and listened. The voice that came through the speaker belonged to a princess, 25 years old, unmarried, and the subject of the most public love affair in the country. She said she would not marry the man she loved. She said she was mindful of the church's teaching. She said she was conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth. She said she had reached the decision entirely alone. The statement took less than a minute to read. When it was finished, the BBC returned to its scheduled programming, and the silence that followed was the sound of a life narrowing in real time. The woman who spoke those words was Princess Margaret, younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II. The public knew her as the glamorous one, the witty one, the Windsor who smoked and danced and stayed out late, the royal who was allowed to be human. What the public did not fully see was the machinery behind that evening's broadcast, the church doctrine, the cabinet consultations, the institutional memory of an abdication that had nearly destroyed the crown 2 decades earlier, and the impossible position of a sister who was also a sovereign. This is the story of Elizabeth and Margaret, two sisters raised side by side in a castle during a war, separated not by distance or hatred, but by the weight of an institution that needed them to become different people. It stretches across 7 decades, 2 marriages, a coronation, a divorce, and a question that neither sister could answer. What happens to a family when duty and love cannot occupy the same room? But to understand how a 25-year-old princess ended up surrendering the central love of her life in a typed statement read into the evening air, you have to go back further than the romance, further than the coronation, further even than the war. You have to go back to the moment when the monarchy reached into a quiet family of 4 and split it in two, not with malice, not with cruelty, but with a kind of institutional logic that treated 2 little girls as instruments of the state before either of them was old enough to understand what that meant. This is the story of Elizabeth and Margaret, the Windsor sisters, born 4 years apart, raised almost as twins, educated side by side, photographed endlessly together, and then separated by a force neither of them chose: the weight of the British crown. One became the most famous monarch on earth. The other became the woman history remembers as the sister who was not allowed to love freely. And the distance between those two fates was never as wide as it looked from the outside, because the thing that made it devastating was how close they remained, even as the institution pulled them apart. Before any of that, they were just 2 daughters of a man who never expected to be king. Albert Frederick Arthur. George, known to his family as Bertie, was the Duke of York, the second son, the quiet one, the brother with the stammer, who had spent his early public life visibly uncomfortable in front of microphones and crowds. He married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, a Scottish aristocrat with a warmth and social confidence that complemented his reserve. And by the time their second daughter was born in 1930, the Yorks had settled into something that looked remarkably like comfortable irrelevance. They were royal, but not central. They had duties, but not the weight of succession. They had a townhouse at 145 Piccadilly, a stone's throw from Hyde Park Corner, and a country life at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. And what they built inside those walls was, by every account, a genuinely happy family. Not happy in the manicured way that royal households often project for public consumption, but happy in the specific, domestic, slightly disorganized way that families are happy when nobody is watching too closely. Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born on April 21st, 1926, delivered by cesarean section at the Mayfair home of her maternal grandparents. Princess Margaret Rose was born on August 21st, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, the ancestral home of the Bowes-Lyon family, 4 years apart. Close enough to share a nursery, a governess, a rhythm of life. Their governess, Marion Crawford, Croffy they called her, later described a household built around routine, affection, and an almost startling normality for people who lived inside one of the most visible dynasties on earth. The girls had a schedule: lessons in the morning, walks in the afternoon, games and drawing before bed. They had dogs, corgis, always corgis, a breed Elizabeth fell in love with as a child and never abandoned. They had a world that was small, protected, and defined by the presence of two parents who, whatever their public obligations, made their daughters feel like the center of something solid. Elizabeth was the elder, careful, contained, orderly, the kind of child who lined up her shoes before bed and kept her toy horses in neat rows. She had a seriousness that people noticed early, not a heaviness, but a steadiness, as though even as a girl, she understood that the world expected something particular from her, even if that something had not yet been named. Margaret was different from the start. She was funnier. She was louder. She had a gift for mimicry that could reduce a room to laughter, a sharp ear for music, as you would later become an accomplished pianist, and a natural magnetism that drew the attention of every gathering she entered, even as a small child. Where Elizabeth observed, Margaret performed. Where Elizabeth waited, Margaret reached. Their father adored them both, but there was a particular tenderness in how he responded to Margaret's spark, as though her irreverence was something he recognized in himself but had never been permitted to fully express. He called them his two pride and joys. He meant it equally. The world would not treat them equally. You have to understand what the York family was in the early 1930s to feel the force of what happened next. They were not the center of the monarchy. That belonged to Elizabeth's uncle, Edward, the Prince of Wales, glamorous, modern, wildly popular, photographed constantly, and assumed by everyone to be the future of the institution. Edward was the heir. The Yorks were the backup plan nobody expected to need. Bertie was the dutiful second son, doing his rounds of factory visits and regional engagements. His wife hosted teas and smiled at charity events. Their daughters were charming, but constitutionally irrelevant. That was the arrangement. And then, on December 11th, 1936, the arrangement was destroyed. Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American socialite whom the Church of England and the British establishment refused to accept as queen consort. The abdication crisis lasted only a matter of weeks in its public phase, but its consequences would reverberate through the royal family for the rest of the century. In constitutional terms, the transfer of power was resolved quickly. In human terms, it detonated the York family's private world. Bertie became King George VI, a man with a speech impediment ascending to a role that required him to address the nation by radio. His wife became queen consort, thrust into a public prominence she had married specifically to avoid. Elizabeth, aged 10, became heir, presumptive to the throne. Margaret, aged 6, became the younger sister of the future queen. That is the first invisible line drawn through their lives, not by a person, but by a constitutional fact. One sister now had a destiny, the other had proximity to it, and the two of them were too young to understand the difference, which may have been a mercy, because the difference would come to define everything. The abdication did something else that would shadow Margaret's life for decades, something less visible than the succession shift, but more corrosive. It taught the monarchy at the deepest institutional level that a royal marriage could break the crown. A king had chosen a divorced woman over his duty, and the cost had been a constitutional crisis that humiliated the institution, divided the government, fractured the royal family, and forced a stammering second son onto a throne he had never wanted. That lesson, that love, when it collided with the Church of England and the expectations of public life, could not be allowed to win, was absorbed into the bloodstream of the monarchy like a slow poison. The men who ran the palace, the government, and the church did not forget. They could not afford to forget. And when, nearly 20 years later, another member of the royal family fell in love with another divorced person, those men would reach for the same playbook, because it was the only one they had. But that story was still years away. In 1936, Margaret was 6 years old, and the thing that had just happened to her family was something she would only fully understand much later, when it was already too late. The years between the abdication and the end of the Second World War were, in a strange way, the last period in which the sisters' lives ran on parallel tracks. When war broke out in September of 1939, the two princesses were moved to Windsor Castle for safety. Their parents remained in London, enduring the Blitz, visiting bombed neighborhoods, walking through rubble in heels and hats, refusing to leave Buckingham Palace even after it was struck by German bombs on multiple occasions. The Queen Consort famously said she was glad the palace had been bombed because now she could look the East End in the face. Elizabeth and Margaret at Windsor lived a version of wartime childhood that was both sheltered and surprisingly real. They participated in air raid drills. They learned to use stirrup pumps. They grew vegetables in the castle grounds. They knitted socks and scarves for soldiers. They staged pantomimes, elaborate Christmas performances with costumes and scripts and musical numbers performed for an audience of staff, estate workers, and local children, in which Margaret, predictably and irresistibly, stole the show every time. In October of 1940, when Elizabeth was 14 and Margaret was 10, the two sisters made a radio broadcast on the BBC's Children's Hour, addressing the children of the Commonwealth who had been evacuated from their homes. Elizabeth read the prepared text with careful formality, her voice already carrying the measured cadence that would become one of the most recognizable sounds in the English-speaking world. Margaret chimed in at the end with a cheerful "Good night, children," that charmed the nation. Even then, the dynamic was visible to anyone paying attention. Elizabeth was the voice of reassurance, of stability, of the institution speaking to its people. Margaret was the warmth, the human note, the sister who made the machinery feel like a family. But underneath the pantomimes and the vegetable gardens and the knitting, a separation was quietly underway that neither girl had chosen, and only one of them fully understood. After 1936, Elizabeth's education took on a constitutional seriousness that Margaret's never matched. Elizabeth studied law and constitutional history with Henry Martin, the vice provost of Eton, a donnish, precise man who came to Windsor to prepare the future queen for a role that was no longer theoretical. She learned the mechanics of government, how Parliament worked, what the sovereign's constitutional obligations were, how the Privy Council functioned, what the Crown's relationship to the Commonwealth meant in practical terms. She was being shaped carefully and methodically, with the full understanding that she would one day sit on the throne. Margaret received the same governess, the same general instruction in French and history and music, but nobody was shaping her for sovereignty because nobody needed to. She was despair, and the cruelty of despair's position is not that it comes with fewer privileges. Margaret had plenty of privilege, more than almost anyone alive. The cruelty is that it comes with fewer reasons. Elizabeth had a clear purpose waiting for her, a role so large it would consume her entire life. Margaret had charm, intelligence, musical talent, a gift for performance, and no defined constitutional function whatsoever. She had rank without purpose, glamour without a direction to point it in. And she was bright enough to feel the difference, even if she could not yet name it. The public did not see this fracture forming. What the public saw during and after the war was one of the most appealing family images in modern British life. A king who had not asked for the job but did it with visible decency and quiet courage. A queen consort who smiled through the bombings and the rationing and the grinding anxiety of wartime. And two young princesses, one serious, one dazzling, growing up through austerity alongside the nation. George VI and Queen Elizabeth were not glamorous in the way that Edward VIII had been glamorous. They were reassuring. They represented survival, steadiness, and the idea that the monarchy could endure because it was staffed by people who would never abandon their posts. That image was powerful, and it was sincere, and it papered over the fact that the institution was already asking the two sisters to become very different kinds of people without telling either of them what it would cost. The years after the war should have been a kind of golden stretch, and in some ways they were. The monarchy had survived. The nation was rebuilding. Elizabeth married Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark on November 20th, 1947, at Westminster Abbey, a marriage that combined duty with what appeared to be genuine, if disciplined, love. Philip was tall, confident, naval, and possessed of a bluntness that Elizabeth seemed to find both grounding and privately amusing. Their first child, Charles, was born a year later. The machine of succession was working. The institution could breathe, and Margaret, meanwhile, now a teenager and then a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into the role the public was hungry for, the royale, who was allowed to be fun. She was photographed at nightclubs, at the theater, at parties in Mayfair and Chelsea, where the post war smart set drank and danced and talked until the small hours. She smoked, publicly, elegantly, through a long cigarette holder that became one of the defining images of mid century royal style. She stayed out late. She had a wit that could be cutting and generous in the same breath, and a beauty that was less restrained than her sister's composure. Darker, sharper, more alive to the room. The press loved her because she gave them what Elizabeth never could: spontaneity, glamour, and the faint, thrilling suggestion that she might do something unexpected. There is something about that period worth sitting with for a moment. Margaret was not rebelling. She was not acting out. She was filling the only space available to her. Elizabeth's world was narrowing toward duty, constitutional briefings, red boxes, overseas tours, standing in for their ailing father with increasing frequency. Margaret's world was widening toward pleasure, art, society, and the emotional life that royalty usually keeps hidden behind closed doors. One sister was being absorbed by the institution. The other was being offered its bright surface and nothing underneath. That arrangement, the air and despair, the duty and the decoration, held as long as their father was alive to mediate between the public monarchy and the private family. George VI loved both his daughters. He understood Margaret's restlessness, perhaps because he shared it in a way his position never allowed him to express. He protected her from the institution's harder edges because he could, because he was the king, and because the tenderness he felt for his younger daughter was one of the few private indulgences his life still permitted. But his health was failing, and everyone who loved him could see it. He had undergone surgery for a blocked artery in his right leg in 1949. Doctors discovered a malignant tumor in his left lung in September of 1951, and the lung was removed. He was 55 years old and looked older. The man who held the family together and who mediated between Elizabeth's duty and Margaret's hunger, who absorbed the institution's demands so his daughters did not have to, who carried the weight of a crown he had never wanted with a grace that cost him everything, was disappearing. And everyone around him could see it except perhaps the public, who were told the king was recovering and chose to believe it. It was during this period, the late 1940s and early 1950s, while the king weakened and Elizabeth increasingly stepped into his role, that Margaret's relationship with Group Captain Peter Townsend deepened into something that would reshape her life. Townsend had entered the royal household not as a suitor, but as a trusted servant of the crown. Born in 1914, he was 15 years older than Margaret, old enough to have fought in the Battle of Britain, where he was credited with shooting down at least 11 enemy aircraft and was decorated with the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, he became an equerry to George VI, a position that placed him inside the innermost circle of royal domestic life. He was, by every account, steady, courteous, well-liked, and entirely at home in the rhythms of the household. He accompanied the family on tours. He was present at dinners. He was part of the texture of their daily world. He was also married with 2 sons until his marriage ended in divorce in 1952, a divorce in which he was the innocent party, a detail that mattered legally but would prove insufficient to protect him from the institutional machinery that was about to consume his life. The relationship between Margaret and Townsend grew inside the household, which is a detail that matters more than it might seem. He was not an outsider breaking into the royal world. He was already there. His closeness to Margaret developed in the same rooms, on the same tours, in the same domestic world where the king was slowly dying. The romance was not a bolt from the blue. It was a quiet accumulation of proximity, trust, and mutual recognition between a young woman who craved emotional depth and a man who offered it without pretension. The exact beginning has never been established with certainty. Some accounts place the first stirrings as early as 1947, others closer to 1950. And that ambiguity is part of the story. It lets the relationship feel like something that grew organically inside a household already under strain, rather than an event with a clear before and after. What is known is that by the time George VI died, Margaret and Townsend were already bound to each other in a way that would soon become the most public-private problem in Britain. Their relationship was not a secret inside the household, it was a secret from the public, which is a different kind of concealment, the kind that works until a single unguarded moment unravels it. On February 6th, 1952, George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham. He was 56 years old. He had gone to bed the previous evening in apparently good spirits, having spent the day shooting on the estate. A valet found him in the morning. The cause was a coronary thrombosis. Elizabeth was in Kenya on a Commonwealth tour, staying at Treetops, a game viewing lodge in the Aberdare Mountains. She learned she was queen before the news reached the public. She was 25 years old. Margaret was 21. Their father was gone, and with him went the last buffer between their private family and the full, unforgiving machinery of the British monarchy. The man who had mediated, who had protected, who had loved them both with a fierce and quiet tenderness, was no longer there to stand between his daughters and the institution that now owned one of them completely. That death changed everything, but not all at once. The grief was real and private and shared between the sisters in ways that have never been made public. What happened next was institutional. Elizabeth became queen. Margaret became the younger sister of the sovereign. The relationship that had been horizontal, two daughters, two sisters, two sides of the same family when stunning, was now vertical. Elizabeth was not just Margaret's elder sibling. She was her monarch. She was the supreme governor of the Church of England. She was the head of the Commonwealth. She was the person whose consent Margaret would eventually need to marry. And she was a woman in her mid-20s, still grieving her father, still learning the weight of the role, still trying to hold together the private person and the public office that were now expected to be the same thing. The sisters were closer in age than almost any other monarch-sibling pair in modern British history, and that closeness made the new hierarchy not easier but harder, because they both remembered what it had been like before. The coronation on June 2nd, 1953, was the event that made the private crisis public. Inside Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth was crowned with medieval solemnity and broadcast to an estimated 27 million television viewers in the United Kingdom alone. The first coronation ever televised, a moment that fused ancient ritual with modern technology in a way that made the monarchy feel both timeless and newly intimate. Outside the abbey, in the milling crowds and the careful choreography of the procession, a detail too small for the cameras but too large for the press to ignore brought Margaret's secret into the open. She was seen brushing a piece of lint from Peter Townsend's uniform jacket. It was an intimate gesture, the kind of thing you do to someone you know well, someone whose body you are comfortable touching, someone you have touched before. It was tiny enough to be deniable and unmistakable enough to confirm what the insiders already knew. A journalist from the People newspaper noticed it. The next morning, the story was everywhere. What followed was not a confrontation. It was something worse. It was a slow, institutional process of deliberation that turned Margaret's love life into a constitutional question, to be managed by men in offices she would never enter. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, Margaret required the sovereign's consent to marry before the age of 25. That meant Elizabeth's consent. That meant the intersection of sisterhood and sovereignty, of private feeling and public law, of a woman who loved her sister and a queen who was bound by the same church doctrine that made the whole problem possible. Townsend, now identified publicly as a constitutional liability rather than a war hero and trusted courtier, was posted to Brussels as heir attaché to the British Embassy. Removed from the household, removed from Margaret's daily world, removed with the bureaucratic efficiency of an institution that knew how to relocate a problem without ever calling it one. Margaret was 22 years old. She would have to wait. That waiting is where the real cruelty lived. Not in a single dramatic refusal, not in a confrontation between sisters, but in the slow, corrosive passage of time during which a young woman's love affair was treated as a matter for the cabinet, the church, the Commonwealth, and the newspapers. Margaret could not simply choose. She had to wait until she was 25, at which point she could theoretically marry without the sovereign's consent, but only if she was willing to accept consequences that had not yet been fully defined, which might include losing her place in the succession, her royal income, and possibly her title. The system did not say no outright. It said, you may have this, but only if you are willing to lose everything else that defines your life. And then it made her wait 3 years to find out whether it meant it. By the autumn of 1955, Margaret had turned 25. Townsend had returned from Brussels. The whole country knew the question that was coming, and the newspapers treated it with the breathless intensity of a national referendum on love itself. Would she choose him? Would the crown bend? Would the sister story have a happy ending? Or would the institution that had already taken her father and consumed her sister now take the man she loved as well? The answer, when it came, would not be happy. And the forces that shaped it, the church, the cabinet, the memory of the abdication, the impossible position of a queen who was also a sister, were already closing around Margaret like walls she could not see and doors she had never been allowed to open. The popular version of what happened next is simple enough to fit in a headline. The queen would not let her sister marry. The real version is harder. It is harder because it is more tangled, more institutional, and more heartbreaking than a single person's refusal. Elizabeth did not simply forbid the match. What Elizabeth did was stand at the exact point where every pressure the monarchy had absorbed since 1936 converged on her at once. And what Margaret experienced, standing on the other side of that convergence, was abandonment. The constitutional facts were these. Margaret had turned 25 on August 21st, 1955. Under the Royal Marriages Act, she no longer needed the sovereign's formal consent to marry. But the act contained a provision that turned that apparent freedom into a second cage. If she married without consent, Parliament could still object within 12 months, and the marriage would be void if both houses voted against it. That meant Margaret's freedom at 25 was not freedom at all. It was a different kind of permission, routed through a different set of gatekeepers. The sovereign's consent had been replaced by Parliament's tolerance, the Church's doctrine, the Cabinet's political calculus, and the Commonwealth's collective opinion on whether a princess of the blood could marry a divorced man whose former wife was still alive. The Church of England's position was unyielding. In 1955, the Church still held that marriage was indissoluble and that remarriage after divorce, while a former spouse lived, was contrary to Christian teaching. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, had made his views clear privately. The marriage was unacceptable. The sovereign was the supreme governor of that church. Elizabeth could not publicly endorse a union that the institution she headed considered doctrinally impermissible. Not without provoking exactly the kind of constitutional collision the monarchy had spent 2 decades trying to avoid. The ghost of Edward VIII was not a metaphor. It was a living political memory. The abdication had nearly broken the institution, and the men who ran the machinery of government, the private secretaries, the cabinet ministers, the archbishops, had spent their careers making sure nothing like it ever happened again. Margaret's love for Peter Townsend looked to those men like the same crisis wearing a different face. There is an important complication that the script should not smooth over. Declassified records later revealed that Anthony Adden, the Prime Minister, had drawn up a possible compromise. Under this arrangement, Margaret could have married Townsend if she agreed to renounce her place in the line of succession and forgo her civil list income. She would keep her title. She would keep her rank, but she would lose the institutional privileges that came with being third in line to the throne. And she would do so publicly, in a way that would carry the unmistakable scent of punishment. That path existed. It was not offered with generosity. It was designed as a transaction in which the cost was calibrated to be just bearable enough that Margaret could not say the system had refused her outright, and just painful enough that acceptance would feel like exile. That is not mercy. That is machinery. Whether Elizabeth personally wanted Margaret to marry Townsend, or personally opposed it, or was simply incapable of separating her own feelings from the institutional voice she was required to speak in, that question has never been fully answered. What is known is that the sisters met during this period, that the consultations with church and cabinet were extensive, and that Margaret was left to make a decision in which every available option cost her something essential. She could marry Townsend and lose her place in the royal structure. The income, the succession, the formal belonging to the institution that was, for better or worse, the only world she had ever known. She could abandon Townsend and keep her place in a system that had just demonstrated, with a meticulous courtesy, that her happiness ranked below its continuity. There was no third door. There was no version of this story in which Margaret got to be both fully royal and fully loved on her own terms. The public, meanwhile, treated the question as a kind of national romance. Newspapers ran daily speculation. Photographers camped outside Clarence House. Opinion polls were commissioned. Bookmakers took bets. The country was divided, and not along political lines, but along emotional ones. Some believed Margaret should be free to marry whomever she chose. Others believed the crown could not survive another marital scandal so soon after the abdication. What almost nobody acknowledged was the cruelty of the spectacle itself. A 25-year-old woman's most intimate decision, being debated in editorials parsed by constitutional lawyers, discussed in cabinet meetings, and wagered on by strangers, while she sat in rooms where the answer was being constructed around her by men, on paper, in language that had nothing to do with love. You have to understand what that kind of exposure does to a decision. It does not clarify, it paralyzes. Every week that passed without a resolution deepened the public's investment and narrowed Margaret's options. Townsend had returned to London. They were seen together at dinners, at the homes of friends who tried to provide cover. The anticipation built. Editorial writers composed arguments for and against as though they were debating a bill in Parliament rather than the emotional future of a woman they had never met. And inside that anticipation, Margaret was not choosing. She was being slowly surrounded by a conclusion that had already been reached by every institution that mattered. The church, the government, the palace machinery, and that was now waiting for her to articulate it herself so that the system could say the decision was hers. On the evening of October 31st, 1955, Clarence House issued a statement. The BBC interrupted its regular programming to broadcast it. The nation, which had been holding its breath for weeks, received its answer not as drama, but as careful, composed administrative prose. Margaret's words were short, measured, and devastating in their restraint. She said that she had been mindful of the Church's teaching, that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth. She said she had decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. She said she had reached the decision entirely alone. That last phrase, entirely alone, is the one that lingers. Whether it was true in the literal sense is almost beside the point. It was true in the emotional sense. Margaret had been surrounded by advisors, by precedent, by doctrine, by the institutional memory of an abdication that happened when she was 6 years old. And at the end of all of it, she was the one who had to speak the words. She was the one who had to stand in the wreckage of her own love story and frame it as duty. She was the one who had to make the system's decision sound like her own. The monarchy did not break her publicly. It gave her the language to break herself. The scene itself resists dramatization precisely because it is so small. A typed statement, an evening broadcast, a room in Clarence House where presumably the lamps were on and the staff moved quietly and the ordinary business of a royal household continued around a moment that ended the most consequential emotional chapter of Margaret's life. No confrontation, no raised voices, no visible collapse. Just a woman's voice, carried by radio into millions of homes, saying that she would not have what she wanted, but the silence after the broadcast is the thing to sit with. Not the words, the silence. The moment when the country absorbed the fact that the love story was over and that the monarchy had once again chosen its own preservation over the happiness of someone inside it. The monarchy could stage coronations with transcendent certainty, could orchestrate processions and ceremonies that moved millions to tears. But when faced with a human problem inside the family, a woman who loved a man the institution could not accommodate, it reverted to caution, distance, and ritualized pain. The immediate aftermath unfolded along predictable lines, which made it worse. The newspaper praised Margaret's sacrifice. The church expressed its approval. The establishment exhaled. Editorial writers who had spent weeks stoking public anticipation now commended the princess for her sense of duty, as though the outcome had been inevitable all along, as though they had not been the ones turning her private agony into a public circus. Elizabeth privately may have felt relief or guilt or sorrow or some combination of all three. The historical record does not say, and the sisters' private conversations from this period have never been disclosed. What is visible is the shape of the loss. Margaret did not only lose Townsend, she lost the belief that the system she had been born into would ever choose her over itself. She lost the faith that being royal meant being protected, because what she had learned was that being royal meant being useful, and her usefulness depended on her compliance. Townsend, for his part, left the center of British public life with the same dignified restraint he had shown throughout. He returned to Brussels. He later married Marie-Luce Gemenier, a young Belgian woman, in 1959. He wrote memoirs. He lived quietly in France. He died in 1995 at the age of 80. His life continued and found its own peace. Margaret's did too, but in a form that never quite recovered the thing that had been taken from it. What came next looked for a time like reinvention. In February of 1960, Queen Elizabeth formally announced her consent to Margaret's engagement to Anthony Armstrong Jones, a celebrated society photographer whose reputation moved easily between aristocratic drawing rooms and bohemian studios. Armstrong Jones was handsome, witty, socially dexterous, and thoroughly unlike the men the royal family usually produced or attracted. He was creative. He was irreverent. He had a professional life of his own and a circle of friends that included actors, designers, writers, and dancers, exactly the kind of world Margaret had always craved. They married at Westminster Abbey on May 6, 1960, in what became the first royal wedding broadcast live on television, watched by an estimated 300 million viewers worldwide. Armstrong Jones was made Earl of Snowdon. Margaret became Countess of Snowdon. Two children followed, David, Viscount Linley, born November 3, 1961, and Lady Sarah Armstrong Jones, born May 1, 1964. The marriage offered everything the Townsend affair had denied: a husband the church could accept, a public ceremony the institution could celebrate, and the appearance of a future that Margaret had chosen rather than been denied. And for a stretch of years, the appearance was seductive enough to believe. Margaret and Snowdon became one of the most photographed couples in Britain, moving at the intersection of royalty and the arts. Theater openings, ballet galas, photography exhibitions, the smart dinner parties of 1960s London. They bought a home on the island of Mustique in the Caribbean, where Margaret could swim, entertain, and live at a remove from the formality that defined her London existence. She had always craved a life with genuine creative texture, and Snowdon gave her access to one. They were glamorous in a way that felt modern and slightly dangerous, as though the monarchy had finally produced a couple who could keep pace with the culture shifting outside the palace walls. But the marriage that looked like liberation was already corroding from within. The qualities that had made them magnetic together, his irreverence, her intensity, his social fluency, her need for devotion, became weapons when the intimacy soured. Snowdon could be cutting in private, capable of small cruelties that accumulated over years. Margaret could be imperious, demanding a deference that sat uneasily beside the bohemian equality their public image suggested. Affairs developed on both sides. Both. The distance widened not through a single betrayal, but through the slow, grinding erosion of two strong personalities who had stopped being kind to each other. By the early 1970s, the fractures were visible to their social circle. By the middle of the decade, they had become impossible to conceal from the press. In 1976, photographs of Margaret on Mustique with Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior, were published in the British tabloids. The images were not scandalous by later standards: Margaret in a swimsuit, Llewellyn at her side, the Caribbean sun making the whole thing look like a postcard from a life the public had not been invited to see. But in the context of the 1970s and the expectations that still surrounded a princess of the blood, the photographs were explosive. They confirmed what the gossip columns had been hinting at for years. The Snowdon marriage was over in all but legal fact. The divorce came in 1978. Margaret was 47 years old. She was the first senior member of the royal family to divorce since Henry VIII, a fact that carried its own bitter irony. The woman who had been denied marriage to a divorced man on grounds of church doctrine was now divorced herself, in a church and a country that had moved just far enough to permit the dissolution, but not far enough to spare her the judgment that came with it. The script should resist treating the Snowdon marriage and its collapse as a separate story disconnected from Townsend. It is not separate. It is the long echo of October 31st, 1955. Margaret was a woman who had been denied one form of chosen life and who spent the next 2 decades trying, with genuine effort and genuine hope, to build another. And the building kept failing, not because she lacked intelligence or desire or capacity for love, but because the first wound had never healed and the institution that inflicted it had never acknowledged the cost. The system had taken something from her and then expected her to carry on as though the taking had been reasonable. She carried on. But the carrying cost her everything it was supposed to protect. The later years darkened without spectacle. Margaret's public image hardened into a version of herself that the tabloids found easier to manage than the complicated woman underneath, the difficult princess, the heavy smoker, the late night royal, the woman who demanded deference and delivered sharp remarks when she did not receive it. Behind that image was a life that was narrowing. Her health deteriorated severely over the course of 2 decades. She had part of a lung removed in 1985. She suffered severe scalding to her feet in a bathing accident in 1999. A series of strokes beginning in 1998 progressively robbed her of mobility and sight. By the early 2000s, the woman who had once been the most glamorous figure in the royal family was confined to a wheelchair, partially sighted and visibly diminished, though those who saw her in private said her wit remained, which may have been its own kind of cruelty, to have the mind outlast the body by that much. She died on February 9th, 2002, at King Edward VII Hospital in London, after further stroke and cardiac complications. Her children, David and Sarah, were with her. She was 71 years old. There is a detail about the timing that is almost too precise to be coincidence, though of course it is. Margaret died on February 9th, 3 days after the 50th anniversary of her father's death on February 6, 1952. The loss that had elevated Elizabeth and displaced Margaret, the death that turned one sister into a queen and the other into a constitutional afterthought, was still sitting beside Margaret at the end of her life, close enough to touch on the calendar. That detail should be handled quietly because it does not need emphasis. It speaks for itself. Elizabeth survived her by 20 years. She died on September 8th, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland at the age of 96, the longest reigning monarch in British history. The sisterhood that had defined both their lives, the closeness and the asymmetry and the love that had to survive the weight of the crown pressing down on it for half a century, belongs now entirely to memory. Neither woman can speak to what they felt about each other, about Townsend, about the evening in 1955 when a typed statement ended one version of Margaret's life and began another. What remains is carried by the next generation. David Armstrong Jones is 64 years old. He is the second Earl of Snowdon and is known in the design world through his furniture company, Lindley. Lady Sarah Chatto is 61. She works as an artist and in 2024 became president of the Royal Ballet School, a role that extends one of the strongest threads in her mother's life, because Margaret's love of ballet and the performing arts was one of the few passions the institution never tried to take from her. The cultural afterlife of the sisters has been shaped most visibly by two productions. PBS's 2018 documentary, Margaret, the Rebel Princess, framed her life explicitly as part of the social and sexual revolutions of the 20th century. Netflix's The Crown made the sister story globally legible for a new generation. Vanessa Kirby played the young Margaret opposite Ben Miles as Townsend. Helena Bonham Carter took the role into middle age, and Leslie Manville played the older Margaret in the final season, with Timothy Dalton as the elder Townsend. Those dramatizations compressed a web of institutional pressures into a cleaner sister versus sister conflict, which is emotionally effective but historically incomplete. The real story is not that Elizabeth refused Margaret. The real story is that the system gave Elizabeth no good option and gave Margaret no real choice. And the two of them had to keep being sisters inside a structure that made sisterhood, in the fullest human sense, almost impossible. The cost of a famous name is not only scrutiny, it is usefulness. Elizabeth was useful to history in one way, as sovereign, as the embodiment of continuity, as the woman who held the institution together for 70 years. Margaret was useful in another, as the glamorous one, the human one, the sister the public could project its desires onto, And the tragedy is that their love for each other had to survive the fact that only one of them was ever allowed to choose freely. And even that one, the queen, the elder, the woman with the crown, may not have experienced her own choices as free at all. There is no neat moral. There are just two little girls at Windsor, raised together in a castle during a war, staging pantomimes and growing vegetables and sharing a life that history would slowly, gently, and permanently divide. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.